Hi, this is Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to take a look at some of the post-World War I treaties that the United States is going to be a part of as it tries to maintain peace throughout the world, but also begins to retreat into a more isolationist position. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio, which states that the United States pursued efforts to maintain peace in the world, but also moved away from the role of world peacekeeper and limited its involvement in international affairs. So after the end of World War I, and after the failure of President Wilson to have the Senate ratify the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations Charter, the United States is ultimately going to begin to move away from a world leadership position. On August the 25th, 1921, they are going to sign a separate peace treaty with Germany, and then also, remember, not join the League of Nations, despite the fact that it's President Wilson's idea and a major part of his 14 points that he brought with him to the Paris Peace Conference. The United States membership in the League of Nations will not happen. Now, there are going to be ramifications for that I'm sure we'll cover in a future video lesson. But we're going to be taking a look at some additional post-war treaties that are taking place. So what actions will the U.S. take to help maintain peace in a post-World War I world? We've just endured 4 years of war, the most costly war in human history. What can America do to help maintain some peace in this new world after World War I is over? One of the major events that's going to take place in 1921 and into 1922 is the Washington Naval Conference. And this conference is called together by both Congress as well as the new President Warren G. Harding. There are a number of countries who are in attendance: Japan and China, the United States, France, the Netherlands, Italy, Portugal, Britain, and Belgium. Now, the purpose for this naval conference is to make sure that the area of the South Pacific does not engage in a naval arms race. As we'll see in the map coming up, there are a number of countries that have and control territories in this part of the world, and we're concerned that we're going to enter into an arms race similar to the one prior to World War I. We also want to establish security agreements with these nations to make sure that there's no additional territorial expansion, which might lead to conflict. And we want to make sure that everybody kind of understands what's happening and avoid the problems that led us up to the start of World War I. So if we take a look at the Pacific, there's a number of countries here. We've got England, we've got France, we have the United States, and we have Japan, who's an emerging world power as well. The Japanese are looking to expand their influence into the Pacific, and the concern here between these nations is that expansionary tendency that the Japanese have might lead to an arms race as each side begins to build up its naval forces in hopes of preserving and maintaining their colonies in this part of the world. Well, what does the United States want? Well, in terms of the Pacific, the United States want to obviously prevent Japanese expansion further into the Pacific. This is something America's been concerned about ever since the Japanese defeat of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War back in 1904. We also want to avoid conflict with Great Britain. We formed an alliance with Britain during World War I, and we want to make sure that we try to maintain that friendship with them, as potentially we might need their help against the Japanese somewhere down the road. We want to make sure that we maintain and establish a good naval ratio, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but that the United States stands at the top of this ratio that's going to be developed between these countries as part of these naval agreements. And we also need to make sure that China remains open to U.S. trade, and that John Hay's open door policy, established at the end of the 1800s, is still in effect moving forward. Great Britain also has a lot to gain and also a lot to lose if we don't solve some of these problems in the Pacific. So what does Great Britain want? Great Britain wants to maintain peace and stability in the Western Pacific. So England has been down there for a very long time. They have lots of colonies. They have lots of investments down in this part of the world. So they want to make sure that it is a peaceful part of the world and not to disrupt British business and trade. Like the Americans, the British want to prevent this Japanese encroachment onto these British territories. If Japan is going to expand into the Pacific, then they may potentially try to take away some of these British possessions. The British want to make sure that they maintain a relatively peaceful relationship with the United States and prevent that arms race from developing, as well as to secure Hong Kong, Singapore, and other areas that they have. So the British want to lock things down, prevent expansion on the part of the Japanese, and maintain a good relationship with the United States and avoid this arms race. So what does Japan want out of this conference? Well, they do want to sign a naval treaty with the United States and Britain so that all countries involved are kind of chilled out a little bit and no one's worried about this more aggressive actions the Japanese are taking. Speaking of which, the Japanese want official recognition of their interest in Mongolia and Manchuria, and they are concerned about the growing U.S. fleet in the Pacific, so they want that treaty in place and certain agreements in place to make sure that the United States does not become a larger presence in the Pacific, where Japan is looking to expand its influence. So Japan wants to be the country in charge of this part of the world and wants to reduce the influence of the British and the Americans. So out of the Washington Naval Conference, we're going to see two major treaties signed. The first one is the Five-Power Naval Limitation Treaty. This treaty is going to be signed between the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, and it will limit the amount of ships essentially in each nation's navy. And in order to meet these limitations, some countries may need to destroy their ships in order to reduce the amount that they have. We're also going to limit the size of ships used by each nation and put a moratorium on the construction of new battleships for about 10 years. Now, there are some other aspects to this limitation treaty, but these are pretty much the basics. Now, also signed during the Washington Naval Conference is the Nine-Power Treaty. The Nine-Power Treaty will essentially maintain John Hay's original open-door policy, which allowed for an open trade in China. We're going to make sure that China's borders are respected and that none of these European or Western powers take over and establish colonies or control directly of China's government. And that, again, China will remain open to trade from other nations. So everybody wants to make sure that they're able to exchange goods and trade and prosper in China. In terms of the naval treaties, we're going to be setting up a ratio of tonnage. And this is the way that they determined how you would, or how many ships you would be able to build. They used the tonnage of those ships. So the ratio is 5.53, and then the French and the Italians are at 1.67. But the major three countries of America, Great Britain, and Japan will be 5.53. So 525,000 tons of displacement for the United States. Same thing for England, but a lesser amount of tonnage for the Japanese. And then even less than that for the French and the Italians. This naval conference is a success. It is supported by many peace organizations across the world. These treaties signed at the conference will prevent an arms race in the Pacific. That brings us to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed on August the 27th, 1928. Now, originally, this idea of outlawing war was proposed by the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Aristide Briand. And he originally believed this should be an agreement between the United States and France, and that this agreement would essentially outlaw war between these two countries. Now, Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg suggested that what the United States and France do was invite other nations to join them in outlawing war, that this doesn't just need to be something between the United States and France, that this can be something that many nations of the world could engage in, and sign this pact as an agreement to basically make war illegal, to promise to their people and to the rest of the world that they would take other steps before declaring war. So in 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact essentially does two things: outlawed war as, quote, an instrument of national policy, and that nations should resolve their disputes peacefully. The 15 original countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and eventually 47 other nations will sign this agreement. And this is a wonderful agreement which essentially outlaws war. It's an anti-war treaty. And this famous political cartoon shows Mars, the god of war, walking into the sunset, his hands clasped behind his back, his sword sheathed, as 15 nations signed an anti-war treaty. And there was a lot of high hopes in the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact that we would actually be able to achieve this goal and that war would be made illegal, essentially. And all the countries in blue eventually will sign this pact and promise to not use war as a means of diplomacy with one another and to resolve their differences peacefully. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is wonderful, and so is the naval treaties that limit these arms. But essentially, America's best means of maintaining peace was to withdraw from the world stage. Americans were disillusioned after the Paris Peace Conference, the failure of the Treaty of Versailles to establish a just and fair peace after 4 years of war, the debate and the rejection of the League of Nations that took place here in the United States between President Wilson and the United States Senate, the failure of a compromise between the President and Congress, and the United States' inability to become part of this international peacekeeping body of the League of Nations. In 1920, during his presidential campaign, candidate Warren Harding promised a return to normalcy, that it was time for America to step back from the world stage, to go back to normal and to worry about American issues and not become entangled in these European affairs. And from 1920 till 1939, the United States will remain mostly isolated, coming out to sign some treaties like we've seen in this lesson, but for the most part, pulling back and rejecting its role as a world peacekeeper for international affairs. So some takeaways from this video lesson. The United States will sign a number of post-war treaties designed to prevent future wars, reduce arms, and limit expansion. From the Washington Naval Conference, we have the 5-Power Naval Limitation Treaty and the 9-Power Treaty, which are relatively successful in reducing an arms race and preventing conflict in the Pacific. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact will help the United States to pledge not to go to war to solve problems, but remains mostly symbolic and doesn't have any real weight behind it. And then after all of these issues, the United States begins to retreat into a more isolationist policy and steps away from international affairs. I hope you've enjoyed this video lesson, and I hope you've learned something.